and welcome to the 2021 Donald Blake Center Conference, coming to you from the campus of Walla Walla University in southeastern Washington State. I am Volker Henning, Vice President for Academic Administration at Walla Walla University. Walla Walla University is pleased to be partnering with Adventist Health in bringing you this conference. Tonight's plenary speaker is Dr. David Williams, who will be giving us an understanding of social inequities in health and what we can do about them. Tonight's speaker will be introduced momentarily. Throughout the day tomorrow, there are a number of teach-in sessions that expand on the overall topic of this conference, which is, what does equity look like? At the end of tonight's presentation, you will have the opportunity to answer questions or to ask questions. So please send your questions to 509-233-4993. Text them to that number. The number is in the chat, and that number again is 509-233-4993. Bow your heads with me as we pray. God and Father of mankind, this evening we come to you humbly acknowledging that we are mortal and that we do not live the kind of life that you would wish for us to live. We read in Scripture that there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for we are all one in Christ Jesus. This verse suggests that we are all equal. But as we look around in the world, we see a very different reality. Equality does not exist. And so today, we ask that through this meeting, you will help us to gain a better understanding of your ideal, that you will help us to see what equity really looks like. Thank you for enhancing our understanding. Amen. Dr. Austin Archer from the School of Education and Psychology, Professor of Psychology, will introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening. My name is Austin Archer, and I'm a professor of psychology and education here at Walla Walla University. It is a personal pleasure for me to welcome and introduce this evening the feature presenter for this conference. If you went to the Harvard University website, you would learn, among other things, that Dr. David R. Williams is currently the Florence Sprague Norman and Laura Smart Norman Professor of Public Health and the chair of the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He is also a professor of African and African American Studies and of Sociology at Harvard University. Further, you would learn that Dr. Williams is a prolific researcher and a scholar with more than 500 published articles in the leading journals in sociology, psychology, public health, epidemiology, and medicine. He has appeared on broadcast media ranging from ABC to PBS, Al Jazeera to the Hope Channel, and has been cited in news journals ranging from the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. You would also learn that his work on race, socioeconomic status, and health has received national and international recognition in his election to the National Academy of Medicine, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the National Academy of Sciences, and has won him awards from the American Psychological Association and the American Sociological Association. But when I think about our speaker, my mind goes back to the fall of 1972 on the island of Trinidad, when a skinny 18-year-old from St. Lucia arrived at Cedar Hall, the men's dormitory at Caribbean Union College, which is now the University of the Southern Caribbean. He arrived there to study theology. I was also a resident there at the time while a student at the nearby public university. Cedar Hall was a vibrant place. I remember conversations in the dorm which would sometimes turn into heated arguments or even more heated, but always good-natured arguments on topics ranging from theology to Caribbean politics to West Indian cricket. I remember a young man committed to Christian ministry and Christian education, a commitment that led him to proceed to the seminary at Andrews, where he received his Master of Divinity, but led to detours into health ministry as he took his MPH at Loma Linda University, worked as a health educator in the Adventist hospital system before completing his PhD in sociology at the University of Michigan. And then his ministry shifted to the halls of Yale University, where he began his professorial career before his return to the faculty at Michigan and finally to Harvard. Through this time, he never lost touch with his spiritual ministry and his connection to church life, and currently serves the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists as an associate director in the health department. Looking back to that time in Trinidad, I suspect that neither of us would have imagined that these years hence, I would have the honor to introduce him as one of the most cited scholars in social science and a world leader in his field. I'm proud that I can still introduce him as a friend and welcome him to Walla Walla University and to this conference. Please welcome Dr. David Williams, who will speak on social inequities in health and what we can do about them.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Austin Archer. You never know what to expect when a good friend introduces you, but it's truly an honor and privilege to be here. And as Dr. Archer indicates, we go back for a few decades, I would say. And it's been a good time together, and it's good to be here with friends. This is not the first time I'm speaking at Walla Walla. I have spoken in person at least twice that I can remember, and it's truly an honor to be here with you tonight. I want to leave plenty of time for questions, so I'm going to share my screen and go to my presentation and start our journey tonight in terms of understanding social inequities in health. I want to begin with where the minds of many are in the United States today, and that's the pandemic that we are in, COVID-19 pandemic. And the COVID-19 pandemic has really shed a lot of light for many Americans on the fact that there are large racial inequities in health. And this chart summarizes that pattern. What it shows are what are called age-adjusted odds ratios. So it's comparing the white population to the other racial ethnic populations in the United States. And the way you interpret this is that the indigenous population or Native Americans have a risk of dying adjusted for age that is 2.2 times higher than that of whites. And you can see the Latino population 2.4 times higher, the Black population twice as high, Pacific Islanders 2.6 times higher, Asian Americans about the same level of risk. So the take-home message is there are some populations, typically those historically disadvantaged, that have a higher risk of death. Now, many people that I run into who hear that there are these racial inequities in health think that the majority of people who have died from COVID-19 are persons who belong to populations of color. That is not quite true. So the rate of death and the number of persons who have died are very different. So if you look at the number of persons who have died, you can see that the majority of people, the overwhelming majority of people who have died are white individuals in the United States. Almost 300,000 whites have died from COVID-19. almost 90,000 Latinos and 73,000 African Americans, for example. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind, because sometimes when you hear that there are racial disparities and this group has a higher rate of death, you need to remember that this is a pandemic that is affecting all populations, and numerically, the largest population reflects the largest number of deaths. What is true for COVID-19 is true for most of the leading causes of death in the United States. And I'm just showing you one in the interest of time, and that's infant mortality. Infant mortality refers to a death of a baby before its first birthday. And these are the death rates. So this is the number of deaths per 1,000 live births. And basically what you can see is the elevated risk of death for the Black or African American population and the Native American population compared to the white population, with the Black death rate being more than twice that. So a Black baby born in the US is more than twice as likely to die before his first birthday as a white infant. I just want to let you know that what we see with COVID-19 deaths in the US and what we see in these racial disparities in health in the US, it is not something unique to the US. It's a global phenomenon. In virtually every country of the world where we have data, and where there are persons of different racial ethnic groups, race matters for health, with socially disadvantaged racial populations doing worse in health. So in the interest of time, I'm only going to show you data from one other society, and that's the United Kingdom. And I'm showing you COVID-19 death rates relative to whites. And you can see that Blacks in the United Kingdom, that's mainly Blacks from the Caribbean and Blacks from Africa, among males, they have a 4.2 times age-adjusted higher rate of death than the white population. Instructively, what you're seeing is that the disparity for COVID-19 deaths by race are larger in the UK than they are in the US. For Bangladeshi and Pakistani males, it's 3.6 times higher. For Indian males, it's 2.4 times higher. And for females, you see the pattern is very similar, 4.3 for Blacks, 3.4 for Bangladeshi, Pakistani, 2.7 for Indians. But if I went through countries in Latin America, the African descended population, the indigenous populations in Latin America do more poorly on most indicators of health. It's true in Australia, it's true in South Africa, it's true in New Zealand. So it's a pattern that we find across the world where there are racial ethnic populations. So the big question that leaves us with is, why does that exist? But before I talk about why it exists, I should tell you just the severity of the COVID-19 death rate on America's overall health. There was a report from the Centers for Disease Control, a federal government department, just a few weeks ago that showed dramatic declines in life expectancy in the United States during the first 6 months of 2020 compared to 2019. And honestly, we have not seen life expectancies declines of this magnitude in the United States in about 100 years. So for example, for Black males, the life expectancy decline in 2020, first 6 months, was 3 years compared to 2019. For Hispanic males, it's 2.4 years. For Black females, 2.3 years. For Hispanic females, 1.1 years. For white males, 0.8 of a year. For white females, 0.7 of a year. Those are stark in the size and magnitude of this decline. Sometimes as a result of the opioid epidemic, we have seen declines of 0.1 of a year and 0.2 of a year from one year to the next, but nothing of this magnitude have we seen in a long time. So just highlighting how the damaging the impact of the severity is on overall health. So then we have to ask the question, what drives these large racial inequities in health Why do they exist in the first place? And as a sociologist, I would tell you the first thing I would think of is socioeconomic status. And by that, I mean income, education, occupational status. And why would I think that? Well, in virtually every country of the world where we have data, persons of higher income and higher education and greater wealth and higher occupational status have better health than persons who are worse off compared to them in any of these indicators of socioeconomic status. And then in the United States, there are large racial inequities in economic status. So here is national data for the United States for the year 2018, showing us the racial differences in income. This is median household income by race. I have translated these data in a way that you can't miss the point, that communicates much more clearly. So what I've done is I've standardized the household income of white families in America as $1. And for every $1 of household income that white households receive, Asian households receive $1.23. Two important points to keep in mind to contextualize the Asian gap. Number one, the Asian population in the US, almost 70% of Asians are immigrants. Most of them have come to the United States with very high levels of education. The Asian population as a whole has markedly higher levels of education than the white population. However, more importantly for these data, Asian households have more persons contributing to household income. So if I had showed you a per person or per capita measure of income, whites would have the highest levels of income. But let's look at the historically disadvantaged groups. For every dollar of household income white households receive in 2018, Hispanic households receive 73 cents, and Native American and African American households received 59 cents. What is stunning about the 59 cents figure for Blacks is that in 2018, that is identical to the Black-white gap in income in 1978. You heard me correct, I did not misspeak. I said in 1978, the peak year of the narrowing of the Black-white gap as a result of the anti-poverty policies of the 60s and 70s and the civil rights policies of the 60s and 70s, the gap had been narrowed to 59 cents. And in 2018, it is 59 cents. Has it been stuck at 59 cents all this time? No, it got worse throughout the decade of the 1980s. It wasn't until 1994 that it got back up to 59 cents, and it's been a penny up and down since then. The point I want you to get from this is that most Americans, most of my students and most Americans think we have made more progress than that since the 1970s in reducing the racial gap in income. But that's how large the patterns are. And just to illustrate the racial gap in income in economic circumstances using another indicator, here is 2018 data on the rates of poverty by race in the United States. The federal government every year determines what the level of poverty is. In 2018, the level of poverty is household income of $25,000 or less for a family of 4. If the family is less than 4, then that number falls even lower. And using that threshold, 20% of all African Americans, 10% of all Asians, 25% of all Native Americans, 17% of all Hispanics, and 8% of whites fall below that threshold of poverty. If we look, though, as who is poor in terms of millions of the population, you can see that the largest group of poor people in the United States are white, with almost 16 million poor people, 10.5 million poor Latinos, and almost 9 million poor African Americans. So again, thinking about the rate in terms of the numbers really become important. However, the data I've shown you on income and poverty dramatically understate the racial gap in economic status. What do I mean when I say that? Well, think with me for a minute. Income and poverty reflects the flow of resources into your household. Income reflects your salary and your wages. It doesn't tell us anything about the economic reserves that households have to cushion shortfalls of income. We get that from data on wealth. Wealth refers to your savings, your cash reserves, your investments that you have, your home equity, stocks and bonds and mutual funds. That's what wealth is. And the latest data from the Federal Reserve on racial ethnic differences in wealth indicates that for every dollar of wealth white households have in the United States, this is 2016 data, Black households have 10 pennies and Latino households have 12 pennies. So there are very large racial differences in wealth. When my career started, most researchers thought that the racial differences in health, like we saw for COVID-19 or infant mortality, were simply a function of racial ethnic differences in income and education. Now we know that life is a lot more complicated and the data are more complicated than that. I want to illustrate that for you by looking at life expectancy at age 25. So at age 25, how long will the average person live? And here is data for Blacks and whites. So the average white person at age 25 will live about 5 years longer than the average Black person. So there's a 5-year overall gap by race. However, remember I spoke about the power of socioeconomic status. If we look by education, the gap in health between whites with a college degree or more education and whites who have not finished high school is 6.4 years. That's bigger than the racial gap. And the gap within African Americans, the most highly educated versus those with the lowest education, is 5.3 years. This is an important point because the pattern here is true for most indicators of health status. The gaps in health in the United States within each racial group by income and education are generally larger than the racial gaps in health. As a nation, we have historically focused on the racial gap, pay much less attention to the economic income and education gap, and seldom present the data in the way I'm showing you today. That is looking at race and socioeconomic status at the same time, because life becomes really complicated when we do that. What we find is that at every level of education, race matters, so that white high school dropouts live 3.1 years longer than Black high school dropouts. And as education increases, the gap widens. So there's a 4.2-year gap between whites with a college degree or more education and Blacks with a college degree or more education. In fact, what I'm showing you here, and remember, this is national data for the United States, is something quite stunning. The best off African Americans, those with a college degree or more education, have lower life expectancy than whites with a college degree, than whites with some college, than whites who have finished high school. So what do these data tell us? It tells us that there's something important about your income and education that matters for your health, regardless of your race. But there's something else about race that matters profoundly, even after you've taken income and education into account. And so researchers have been asking, what else is it about race that matters so profoundly for health? And could racism be a critical missing piece of the puzzle to understand the patterning of racial disparities in health? And when I use the term racism, I am primarily referring not to the beliefs and behavior of individuals, but to an organized societal system, a system that categorizes and ranks, devalues and disempowers, and differentially allocates resources and opportunities to different groups. Sure, it is premised on the ideology of inferiority, that some groups are better off than others inherently, and this can lead at an individual level to negative attitudes and beliefs, prejudice and stereotypes, and to differential treatment, that is discrimination, by both individuals and societal institutions. I want to unpack racism for you a little bit this afternoon, evening for me, and show you mechanisms by which it can affect health. And the three main mechanisms I'm going to talk about is through institutional or systemic or structural racism. Individuals use those terms. through individual discrimination, and through racism that's embedded in our culture. And all of these affects a broad range of health outcomes. So let me give you an example of the difference between individual and institutional discrimination by looking at an example of institutional, or some persons use the term structural or systemic discrimination. This is national data for the United States. In the 2012 presidential election, how long did Americans stand in line at a precinct waiting to vote? This is national data. On average, African Americans waited 23 minutes to vote, whites waited 12 minutes, and you can see differences for other groups. Importantly, the differences in how long people stood in line had nothing to do with the behavior of local precinct workers. It's not that precinct workers were telling Blacks to wait, were treating them badly, or anything of the sort. In fact, the differences were heavily driven by where you voted and what was the budget and space constraints. What were the local administrative procedures? How many voters were served by a polling site? What was the staffing level of the facility, and how many people and polling booths could it occupy? So what I'm saying is that it was all about administrative procedures and budget and space, but it led nonetheless to unequal outcomes, although all of the individuals who worked at the precinct were doing their job and treated everyone the same. That's what we mean by institutional or structural or systemic discrimination. We are talking about policies and procedures at the societal level, within societal institutions, that lead to unequal outcomes. And I want to give you an example of one, a powerful one that I and others have studied, that leads to dramatic differences in inequities in the United States. In my TED Talk, I called it the secret sauce that drives racial inequities in the United States. And it's residential segregation, a striking legacy of racism. This is a book by John Sell, a historian at Duke University. He wrote a book about the origins of segregation in the US South and South Africa. He showed that the framers of apartheid in South Africa in the early 20th century looked across the Atlantic and saw how well residential segregation was working in the US, and they said, brilliant, we could implement that in our country. Importantly, he argues that residential segregation by race was one of the most successful domestic policies of the 20th century in the US. Why? It's beneath the radar screen. In the last presidential election, no one really talked about it much, but it leads to dramatic differences in outcomes in our society. I think of segregation as a toxic emission produced by an industrial plant. It's often imperceptible, like carbon monoxide, but when it shows up, valuable resources disappear, like quality schools, or safe playgrounds, or good jobs, or healthy air and water, or safe housing, or good access to transportation and healthcare. Let me share with you some empirical evidence. This is a study done by two of America's most eminent sociologists, William Julius Wilson and Robert Sampson. This studied 171 largest cities in the United States, and they said, because of segregation, there's not even one city where whites live in equal conditions to those of Blacks, and that the worst urban context in which whites reside is considerably better than the average context of Black communities. That was a paper published in 1995, and you said, well, have things gotten better? Okay, let me share with you a paper published in 2020. This is the work of Dr. Dolores Acevedo Garcia of Brandeis University. She has ranked every county in the United States on over 25 dimensions of access to opportunity for kids. She has a website called diversitydatakids.org. And what she's done is rank the indicators for kids are things like the quality of elementary schools and early childhood centers, the high school graduation rate, the levels of household income, of home ownership, of employment, the quality of air, water, and soil, the access to resources for health like green space and healthy food outlets. And what she documents If we look at the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the United States, 67% of all Black children live in the 100 largest metropolitan area are growing up in very low or low opportunity neighborhoods. That's also true of 58% of Latino kids and 53% of Native American kids, compared to about 1 in 5 white and Asian kids. If you look at which children are in the high or very high opportunity neighborhoods, you can see almost 2/3 of all white and Asian kids, and only about 1 in 5 African American or Latino kids are in the high and very high opportunity neighborhoods. Moreover, even the racial differences in income I showed you later are driven by segregation. I will share with you 2 scientific studies that document that. This is the first one by David Cutler, a very prominent economist at Harvard University. He did this study using fancy econometric methods, very rigorous statistical analyses, looking at a national sample of Blacks and whites. And he showed if you could eliminate statistically residential segregation in the United States, you would completely erase Black-white differences in income, in education, and in unemployment, and reduce Black-white differences in single motherhood by 2/3. All of these stark, striking differences are linked to access to opportunity at the neighborhood level. That's a 1997 paper as well. Let me show you a 2018 paper from another Harvard economist, Raj Chetty. He also has created a wonderful atlas. If you want to dig in deeper, it's called the Opportunity Atlas. What he has done is an amazing intergenerational study. He has looked at all access to census data, all census data from 1989 to 2015. And he's asked a simple question. Let's look at Black and white children who start out in life at the same level of household income. How are they doing in the next generation? And he finds that Black boys who start out at the same level of income as white boys, in 99% of census tracts is a group in a neighborhood area, typically about 5,000 to 7,000, 8,000 people. In 99% of census tracts in America, Black boys who start out at the same household level of income as white boys earn less income in the next, their parents, they grew up in households with the same level of income, they earn less income. Why? Because they live in neighborhoods that differ in access to opportunity. Black boys do as well as white boys in neighborhoods with good resources. The problem is there are very few such neighborhoods in the United States. What am I saying this afternoon? I'm saying that racial inequities in education and income that are consequential for life and health do not reflect a broken system. Instead, they reflect upstream, systemic, structural racism. They reflect a carefully crafted system functioning as planned, successfully implementing social policies, many of which are rooted in this racism, the ranking of populations based on their inherent perceived value. These large inequities are not accidents or acts of God. They are not random events. They reflect the successful implementation of social policy. And what low economic status means is that although we are in the same pandemic, the same storm, when you are low in economic status, you're in a different boat. And you're in a boat that is less equipped to weather the storm. Not only that, but research, mine and that of others, indicates that persons of low economic status living in disadvantaged, segregated neighborhoods have higher levels of exposure to a broad range of stressors, like economic stress. Like that examples would be unemployment or not being able to make ends meet at the end of the month, or psychosocial stress like the death of a loved ones, or racial discrimination and physical chemical stresses. I want to talk about the stress of discrimination because that's another mechanism, discrimination at the individual level, that also matters. It's an area where I have done work. This is a scale called the Everyday Discrimination Scale. It's a scale, you can see it was published back in 1997 that I developed years ago. Today, it's the most widely used scale globally to assess discrimination. It's one of my doctoral students is doing a meta-analysis of studies of the everyday discrimination scale. There are over 400 published papers. I haven't published most of those. Look from more than 30 countries in the world that document that everyday discrimination matters for health. And what is striking about this is it doesn't capture all aspects of discrimination, just the little indignities, being treated with less courtesy and less respect than others, receiving poorer service than others, people acting as if they think you are not smart, or if they're afraid of you, or if they think you are dishonest, little indignities. And just to illustrate how powerful a predictor it is, this slide just indicates some of the outcomes that everyday discrimination predicts. That's this adjusting for other confounders and other risk factors. Higher levels of everyday discrimination is linked to incident, which means new cases of metabolic syndrome, of cardiovascular disease, of breast cancer, of type 2 diabetes, higher levels of use of substances to deal with stress, higher levels of multiple indicators of subclinical disease, like coronary artery calcification or intima media thickness, or visceral fat or heart rate variation or AFib, higher levels of asthma, of blood pressure, poorer sleep quality, sleep duration, higher levels of biomarkers like inflammation or cortisol, higher levels of obesity, less engagement with recommendations from your healthcare provider, and higher levels of mental health problems. These are just some of the health outcomes that being high on everyday discrimination is a predictive of. So it's a powerful predictor of health. Let me put it this way. We now have studies from the United States, the United Kingdom, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, that finds that when you identify racial differences in health and you statistically adjust for income and education, and that accounts for some of it, but there still is a residual effect of race, the added burden of race I spoke about earlier. When you add a measure of discrimination to the statistical model, you further explain the racial gap in health. So in other words, we now know that one of the reasons why there are racial inequities in health is because how we treat each other on a day-to-day basis. And the research indicates that the accumulation of the stress of discrimination and the stress of poverty and the psychosocial stresses and economic stresses are leading to what researchers are calling accelerated aging or premature aging or biological weathering. What do they mean by these fancy terms? In plain English, what studies are now finding is that Black people and other populations of color in the United States are literally biologically aging more rapidly on average than whites. And this has been shown by multiple indicators, by measures of telomere length, a marker of biological aging at a cellular level, and other indicators like that. Think of it this way. Your age captures not only how long you have lived, but if you are living in a bad environment, under bad environmental conditions, your age is capturing how long you've been exposed to bad environmental conditions and how physiologically compromised you have become as a result of those exposures. And one of the consequences of this is the earlier onset of chronic disease. I'm showing you one example, national data for the United States. By age 50 to 64, 61% of Black adults have high blood pressure compared to 41% of whites. That pattern for blood pressure is true for kidney disease, it's true for diabetes, it's true for strokes, it's true for a broad range of outcomes. The earlier onset of disease linked to the adverse living and working conditions that individuals face. Here is a study from the UK. What it showed is a study of 28 horses, that when a human being makes an angry face, the researchers could measure physiological changes in the horse. their heart rate would increase, and there were other signs of stress-related behaviors. Well, the same thing happens with humans in how we treat each other. And here is a powerful quote from the book Christ Subject Lessons. It says, every soul is surrounded by an atmosphere of its own. An atmosphere, it may be charged with the life-giving power of faith, courage, and hope, and sweet with the fragrance of love. Or it may be heavy and chill with the gloom of discontent and selfishness, or poisonous with the deadly taint of cherished sin. And it continues, by the atmosphere surrounding us, every person with whom we come in contact is consciously or unconsciously affected. So it's even broadening it, not only even how we treat each other, but even our facial expressions matter for others and can have positive or negative effects on their health. I want to touch base briefly on cultural racism, and then I want to talk about what we can do about these challenges and give you some practical solutions. Now, the racism and the beliefs in inferiority are deeply embedded in our culture, and I want to give you one example of how deeply embedded they are. This is the Beagle Project. It's a project done by a group of researchers. What they did was put a database of 10 million words, a sample of books, newspaper articles, magazine articles that the average college level student would read in their lifetime. What's brilliant about this, if you put American culture in a database, you can say ask of that culture, when the word, for example, Black appears in American culture, what adjective most frequently co-occurs with Black? The answer is poor, then violent, then religious, then lazy, then cheerful, then dangerous. When white occurs, wealthy, progressive, conventional, stubborn, successful, educated. When female occurs, distant, warm, gentle, passive. When male occurs, dominant, leader, logical, strong. So if you've been raised in this society, these are associations you have seen. In fact, look at the 10 most common stereotypes for Blacks and whites. The number next to them is a measure of associative strength. So it shows how closely tied they are to each other. If they always occur together, it would be 1. So interpret it as a simple correlation, although technically it's not that, but it's similar in interpretation. And so you can see the predominance of negative stereotypes for Blacks: poor, violent, lazy, dangerous. You can see some negative stereotypes for whites, but you could see the associative strength is much weaker, but they do exist. This chart helps us to explain some of the challenges we are dealing with in our society. Because what this tells me is that when a police officer sees a young Black male and overreacts, assuming that person is more violent and dangerous than they are, we are not necessarily dealing with a bad cop. We may be simply looking at a normal American who is acting on what is deeply embedded in his or her subconscious because he was raised in this society. These associations are what shapes our assumptions of others. And what research finds is that for most people, when you meet someone, in 1/3 of the time it takes to blink your eye, you quickly note in this country their race, their sex, and their age group. And you make assumptions about them based on the stereotypes in your mind about those social categories. There's overwhelming scientific evidence that leads to racial bias in medical care. And the process is automatic, it's unconscious. I like to tell my students, I think of myself as a prejudiced person. And I say I think of myself as a prejudiced person because I would like to think of myself as a normal human being. And if you are a normal human being, you are probably prejudiced. Now, I didn't say you are racially prejudiced. This is not about race. Every culture, every society has in-groups and out-groups, groups that are viewed positively and groups that are used negatively. And when you meet someone from a group that you have negative assumptions about, it's an automatic process. It's an unconscious process. You will treat that person differently. That is, you will discriminate against that person, often without any conscious awareness of your part. Race is salient in our society, so racial implicit biases are very common. They exist. Studies show in 70% of all Americans that have been studied, 70% of all racial ethnic groups, of all professional groups, police, physicians, teachers, and so on, at least 70 to 80%. The only exception is among Blacks. And among Blacks, it's about 1/3 of Blacks have implicit biases against Blacks. Because again, it's not your skin color, it's what's in your mind. And when I say that if you're normal, you're probably prejudiced, I didn't say you are racially prejudiced, because this is not just about race. You may not have any racial prejudices, but what are your deeply embedded stereotypes about fat people, about gay people, about poor people, about women, about old people? You get the point. About people from this country or that country. Every culture, every society has groups that are viewed negatively, and these beliefs, without our thinking, shape our behavior. Let me show you how consequential these are in the area of medicine. I'll show you 2 studies. Here is a study published last year of 1.8 million hospital births in the state of Florida between 1992 and 2015. When cared for by white doctors, Black babies are 3 times more likely to die than white newborns in the hospital. This disparity is cut in half when Black babies are cared for by a Black doctor. Another example, well, I had another example, and I'll come to it in a minute, that illustrates the differences it makes by the race of the provider. So what can we do to reduce these inequities in health? Well, one of the things is we need to reduce bias in healthcare institutions and professionals. There's actually a study out of the UK, double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized trial that shows 1 dose of a beta blocker eliminated implicit bias among white physicians for the next 2 hours. That's an important study. I say it's an important study because we have political leaders today who say that implicit bias that is very well validated scientifically is fake news. It's not fake news. It reflects fundamental processes in the brain that we can actually eliminate with a pharmacologic agent. I don't think it's practical for us to medicate the entire world's population for the rest of our lives. The good news is there are a number of prejudice reducing strategies like individuation, which is instead of putting people into categories, treating each person as an individual and trying to understand them as an individual, putting yourself in their shoes, perspective taking, increasing interracial contact as strategies that reduce implicit bias. And Professor Patricia Devine at the University of Wisconsin shows all of those strategies in the prior slide. You can put them into a single program. People can learn to be aware of their biases, can increase their concern about their biases, implement all of these strategies, and they are effective in reducing implicit bias. We also need to diversify the workforce of the healthcare system to reduce inequities in health. And this is the randomized controlled trial I was thinking about of Black men in Northern California. What they did, they took a group of Black men from barbershops and flea markets, gave them a coupon, send them to a health screening for a Saturday clinic at a hospital. They were randomized to go to a Black doctor or not. Those who went to a Black doctor, they're all Black men, right? Those who were seen by a Black doctor, a doctor of the same race, were 29% more likely to talk about other health problems, 47% more likely to do screening for diabetes, 56% more likely to get a flu vaccine, 72% more likely to do screening for cholesterol. In other words, they're more fully engaged in the healthcare visit simply by the race of the doctor. I do have good news. If you are not of the same race, can it be possible that we can reduce disparities? And the good news is yes. There's a study that shows that when a certain type of cultural competence was high, even when the providers of a different race, there's no racial disparities in health. This study used a 20-item measure of cultural competence. I'm just showing you some of the measures so you get a feel and a sense of the kind of characteristics that predicts no disparities. The providers who scored high on the scale agreed that family and friends were as important to health as doctors. They agreed that social history contributes to how they care for their patients. They agreed that they were familiar with the lay beliefs their patients had. They agreed that they asked their patients about the alternative therapies that they use. They agreed that they find out what their patients think is the cause of their illness. And they agreed that they involve their patients in decision-making about their healthcare. What emerges here is a degree of respect, a degree of engagement, a degree of communication that occurs between the provider and the patient. And when there are those kind of relationships, this research shows there are no disparities in health. What else do we need to do? We need to create what I call communities of opportunity. If the racism at the level of neighborhoods and opportunity are creating these inequities, we need to think of ways in which we can reduce childhood poverty, where we can invest in early childhood, where we can enhance income and employment opportunities for youth and young adults, where we can improve neighborhood and housing conditions, where we can comprehensively understand the patient in the context of their health challenges. And if we do this, and there's evidence that if we implement these, they can make a difference in improving health. I want to give you an example of an Adventist institution, Loma Linda University Health, that is doing something quite remarkable. They have a large federal clinic, and this is the new building just built in San Bernardino, California. San Bernardino, as you may or may not know, is one of the most disadvantaged cities in the United States economically. It's a city in which less than 20% of high school graduates obtain any additional education, that's including even community college education. So what Loma Linda did is the top floor of their healthcare center, they created what they call a gateway college. It's a college with short-term programs, all of them lasting less than a year, that is providing skills and employment opportunities. It's training the young people from San Bernardino to become a certified nurse's assistant or pharmacy tech or surgical tech or community health worker. It's giving them skills and jobs. And so they are addressing unemployment as a strategy to improve the health of the residents of San Bernardino. What Loma Linda is doing is something that all Adventists have been called to do, and Adventist institutions have been called to do. And my homework assignment for you is to read the 58th chapter of Isaiah and study the book Ministry of Healing that talks about the need to do this. The 58th chapter of Isaiah says the kind of fasting God wants is to free those who are wrongly imprisoned and lighten the burden of those who work for you and let the oppressed go free and remove the chains that bind people and share your food with the hungry and give shelter to the homeless and clothes to those who need them. And if you do this, God promises he will guide you continually. He will satisfy your soul. Your light will rise in the darkness and your gloom will become like midday. And just in case you missed the point in the book of Isaiah, it is emphasized again by Jesus in Matthew 25, where he says on the great day of judgment, he's going to determine those who will come into the kingdom based on, I was hungry and did you feed me? I was thirsty and did you give me something to drink? I was a stranger is an old English word. I was an immigrant and did you invite me in? I was naked and did you clothe me? I was sick and did you visit me? I was in prison and did you come unto me? And in case you missed it in Isaiah 25, the book Desire of Ages says, Christ pictures to his disciples a scene of the great judgment day, and he represented the decision as turning on one point. There'll be 2 classes, and their eternal destiny will be determined by what they have done or neglected to do for him in the person of the poor and the suffering. So what can we do? We can walk in the steps of Jesus, go to the places where there is human need and make a difference. And God has provided comprehensive and detailed instructions. I'm giving you a homework assignment, read the book Ministry of Healing, but let me just highlight some of the things it describes as the work of Isaiah 58, the work that God is calling all of our churches to do. It says we need to establish industries so that poor families can find employment. This is part of our mission. This is part of fulfilling the gospel commission. Carpenters, blacksmiths, and he said, well, none of us are carpenters, blacksmiths, but everyone who understands some line of useful labor should feel a responsibility to teach and help the ignorant and unemployed. She talks about job training by instruction in practical lines. She talks about teaching the poor practical skills, how to cook, how to make and mend your own clothing, how to nurse the sick, how to care properly for the home. She talks about parenting and mentoring and adoptions, are all strategies that are part of our ministry. What would a comprehensive health ministry really look like? I want to close by showing you an example more than 100 years ago of when, for a moment, the church took seriously for a number of years and developed a comprehensive health ministry. It was voted by the General Conference in 1893. The church set up a mission outreach in the city of Chicago with Dr. John Harvey Kellogg in charge of it. What did the Chicago Medical Mission do? It was a free medical clinic. It had a clothing distribution program, a homeless shelter that could accommodate 400 persons per night, a soup kitchen that fed 500 to 1,500 persons a day. Work was at a shelter for those who needed it. There was a lifeboat rescue home. I'll talk a little bit more about that, and a maternity home for unwed mothers, a farm outside the city for drug rehab for persons rescued from Skid Row could go to this place, a school, which is significant. And we are dealing with a time of great Asian prejudice and discrimination. Well, this is not the first time this has happened in US history. This is 1893. If you know US history, you would know in 1882, Congress passed and the US president signed a law that was called the Chinese Exclusion Act. If you were Chinese, you were not allowed to enter the United States. And at that time, where the Chinese population was a stigmatized, discriminated against population, the Adventist Church set up a special outreach for this group, teaching them English so they could be more successful in American society. I want to give you an example of just how radical and comprehensive this program was. There was a ministry to prostitutes. 4 Adventist women the ministry began with would go to the red light district of Chicago at night to talk to prostitutes on the street. They would work in groups of 2 until 1:30 a.m. And in their first year alone, they were successful in persuading 75 girls to leave the street and return to a better life. And if they did that, they could bring them to the lifeboat rescue home. It was for unwed mothers and prostitutes rescued from the street, a comprehensive program of addressing social needs. And many Adventists are unaware that in 1895, the church started a medical school in Chicago. This is almost 10 years before Loma Linda started, with the early years of training in Battle Creek, and then they would move to Chicago for their clinical work. There was a dormitory that was a base for the students and for visiting nurses, and look at a range of programs the medical school offered: a kindergarten, a day nursery for working moms, a free laundry for women, a free employment agency, classes in first aid, hygiene, diet, child training, dress, a placement service for orphans, a placement service for men and women who had been reclaimed from Skid Row. I'm talking about a comprehensive ministry of outreach, meeting social needs, and those are the kinds of activities, if you read the book Ministry of Healing, you see is the work we need to do. It's called medical missionary work, and we are told in every city where we have a church, we need to do this work. Every church should be doing this work. Not only that, we have a special burden as Christians to Black people in America, we were told, because God spoke concerning the captivity of the colored people, this is from the book Southern Work, as verily as he did concerning the Hebrew captives, and said, I have seen the affliction of my people, I have heard their cry, and I have come to deliver them. It continues, the Lord wrought in freeing the Southern slaves. Didn't say Abraham Lincoln, it said the Lord. Yes, he used Abraham Lincoln, but he designed to work still further, to educate, to refine, to ennoble. Those tasks are still incomplete. That's part of our work. Not only that, Southern Work says the American nation owes a debt of love to the colored race, and God has ordained that they should make restitution. Sounds like reparations, right? Make restitution for the wrong they have been done in the past. So what I'm saying today is that the challenges we face in our society is exactly the work that God is calling us to do. Ministry of Healing says Christ's methods alone will give us true success in reaching the people. He mingled with others as one who desired their good. He showed his sympathy. He ministered to their needs, whatever their needs were, won their confidence, and then he bade them follow me. So what I'm saying is God is calling us to a work of addressing the social inequities. The way Jesus manifested and made God's love real to people, God is calling his children today to do the same. And when the character of Christ will be perfectly reproduced in his people by having our hearts broken by the things that break the heart of God, then he will come. And it's our privilege to look for and hasten his coming. If we did this, how quickly the work would be finished. The test of true Christianity is how we love one another. And loving one another is a big deal, but it's even a higher calling that we just not asked to love others, but love others the same way that God loves us. So I leave you tonight with the example of Jesus. The Word became flesh and moved into our neighborhood. Jesus pitched his tent beside ours. He came to where we were, ministered to our needs. There are large social inequities in our world, and we are here. God has placed us here to make a difference, to touch the lives of others, and to help them address their needs and help them experience the love of God.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. I don't know if you can see me. I'm such a technological
I can
idiot.
see it faintly.
Can you see my face?
Okay.
I can see yours. I was here when you spoke, I think it was in 2007, and you were quite an introduction to me at that time in the disparity of access to medical care in this country for persons of minority race, and particularly women, Black
Yes.
women.
Mhm.
I felt that so keenly because I, of course, am a mother, and it isn't just the Black women, it's the children. People are trying to help me here with the sunshine coming in. It's not actually nighttime yet where we are. If we refuse access to women, we also refuse access to the children, you know, because women have that responsibility. So I quote you often in my moral philosophy classes. I've done a little study of my own in the area of Christian ethics, and your comments at the end about the mission of the Christian, if you will, in the world we find ourselves living in is deeply powerful and moves me more than I can actually express right here. You've given me, you've given all of us so much to think about. Before I ask you some questions that have come in, I just want to remind folks that it's not too late. If you have a question for Dr. Williams, you can still text us. I'll see your text message here at area code 509-233-4993. And I'd like to begin with a question about how you interpret the I don't know how to characterize it exactly, but the language of the religious right with regard to racial issues. You've made a pretty careful and persuasive case for what Isaiah and John and virtually every book in the gospel teaches us about what it means to live a meaningful life. But what do we do with the strident religious language that we hear, the racist religious language?
It's complicated because the religious right often engages in compassion. They may even go overseas on mission trips.
Yes.
They are not engaged with domestic issues of inequality, although they may be engaged with global issues of inequality.
Yeah. So
Jesus,
how do you read? It seems like there's a dissonance there, almost like a cognitive dissonance.
There is a dissonance. I'll come to it in a minute, but let me first make the point that when Jesus gave his disciples instructions to go forth, he said, begin at Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Begin when you are. And there are many persons who will go and help people halfway around the world, but wouldn't drive 2 miles or 5 miles to help someone in the same city.
Yeah.
So I think it really raises some fundamental questions of how we understand what God is calling us to do. But there is some research on the topic. One of the challenges we face is, and I don't have the slides, the data to show you the specific numbers, but if you ask many persons in the religious right and many white Americans in general, first, they underestimate the degree of racial inequities that exist. One, they believe that racism was a big issue in America, but it was solved in the 1960s. I've showed you the data for some outcomes. We haven't made much progress since the 1960s. So they overestimate the degree of progress that was made. And three, they believe that to the extent that there are problems, there are inequities, it is the fault of those who are experiencing the inequities. It's their fault because they lack the right values. There is a study done by the Public Religious, I'm trying to remember the name of the organization, PRRI, a national survey that was done that finds the majority of white Americans believe that all racial inequities in America would be solved if Blacks only worked harder. That the problem is Blacks are not working hard enough. And I've shown you what the science shows. It's not that they're not working hard enough. The issue is they are living in areas where there isn't access to opportunity. And if you create those opportunities, they do well. And there are examples of places where that has happened. They take advantage of opportunities and they will do well. And so the challenge is, how do we create those opportunities? But many people believe, what's intriguing, the same study asked Americans, hard work alone is enough to guarantee success in American society. And over 60% of Americans disagree with that, that hard work alone is not enough. But if you said, if Blacks only worked harder, and we have as much as in this study, I don't remember the precise number, but over 70% of Republicans compared to about 30% of Democrats believe that all inequities would be solved if Blacks only worked harder. And they miss the ways in which the inequities we are dealing with are created by larger systemic policies in society.
Okay, that's just, that wants a minute. That just wants a minute to sink in. There is a question from a person engaged in this session who says, in my workplace as a minority, I've experienced everyday racism. What advice do you have on ways to cope with the high level of stress as a result? I'm imagining this person identifies with those images you shared, those charts you shared.
Yes, and so that's really, really good question. I'm glad you asked it because there's only so much you can cover in a little time. And I didn't talk any about the research that indicates that there are a number of things that can reduce the adverse impact of discrimination in employment and other contexts. The first thing I want to say that the ideal, before I talk about what you can do individually, the ideal thing is it would be helpful if you can, if the leadership at your place of work, this may not be feasible everywhere, but it's still the goal, can find a safe, you can find a safe context where they can understand what really happens and the consequences for it. In the field of diversity and inclusion, there is what they call creating places of psychological safety. A place of psychological safety is a place where every person is affirmed and feels valued, and there's willingness to listen and respect everyone, and creating that is a useful strategy, and there's actually evidence of the kinds of interventions that can be implemented that would reduce those occurrences in the first place. So that's the ideal world, is we can reduce the level of occurrence. But what the research has documented is a number of strategies make a difference. Number one is high levels of social support and social interaction, so that we call it the buffering effects of social ties, so that persons who are embedded in social relationships, they are trusted people you can talk to, and you have an outlet, you can share the pain and that you experience. That reduces the negative effects on both physical health outcomes and mental health outcomes. Let me give you an example of just how powerful it is. I'll tell you of a study done in Georgia by Gene Brody and colleagues of African-American adolescents in 9 rural counties in Georgia. They measured discrimination in these kids at age 16, 17, and 18. By age 20, I didn't say age 40, by age 20, those who were consistently high on discrimination as a teen, by age 20, they have higher levels of stress hormones, of epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol. They also have higher levels of systolic and diastolic blood pressure, of C-reactive protein, that's a marker of inflammation in their blood, and higher levels of BMI, higher levels of weight, evident at 20, linked to experiences of discrimination as a teen. That's how early these processes have been documented in the scientific published medical literature. However, the relationship between discrimination exposure and worsening health is completely eliminated among those kids who report good relationships, social ties with their parents and teachers and with their peers. So the quality of support, that community of support has a powerful impact. Given I've talked about a community of support, you will not be surprised with the second factor that I'm going to mention that research documents. Religious involvement reduces, in a national study of Black Americans, high levels of religious involvement, frequency of church attendance, receiving support from members of your congregation, and looking to God for guidance in your life, reduce the negative effects of exposure to discrimination on mental health. And that's a published scientific study that shows the quality is both the social ties, but also the dependence and looking to God for grace and strength makes a difference in reducing the effects of stress. So there are some studies that shows that some psychological characteristics like optimism and purpose in life that also seem to play a role in reducing some of the negative effects of discrimination, just as other types of stressors, by the way, on health.
Okay. So it sounds like it's a combination of,
It's a
trying
combination.
to identify
Yes,
institutional support, if that is present in the workplace, or in your school, wherever you are, but also having some sort of social network away
support.
from there.
That's right.
This may be a little bit, it's a different question, but it's also a personal question. And that seems, I think that this hits us right where we live.
Mhm.
What can a person of color do when they know that their medical provider is not providing the best level of care because of prejudice? For example, a doctor who refused to prescribe pain medication, believing I don't feel as much pain as a white person.
And there are studies that show, there's a recent study published just a couple of years ago that showed of medical students and residents, and shows that they have erroneous physiological beliefs about Blacks. One is that the skin of Blacks are thicker, and another is that Blacks don't feel are much more tolerant of pain. So it's not the majority of healthcare providers, but there are many healthcare providers who have that view. There's some of them who feel, well, I shouldn't give you pain medication because you'll become addicted. And so they are protecting you by not giving you pain medication. So those are real. It's a real challenge. I think what I would say a number of things. One of the things that is recommended is it's helpful for some persons if they can go to see a healthcare provider with a health advocate, not a professional person, but someone else who can accompany them and who can speak up for them and try to make the case, this person needs this kind of care, this is appropriate in this context, that, and sometimes that makes a difference with healthcare providers. Sometimes you may need to change, you may need to find another provider. That's the truth. Now that may not always be the case, especially if this is a specialist that you are seeing and there aren't others there in terms of within your health plan. It can be a challenge, but trying to what you can do on your own. The more aware you are, the more knowledgeable you are about your condition, and try to raise it, I would say, in a non-confrontational way. Don't accuse your doctor of being prejudiced, even if he or she is. That may not be the best way to win his or her support. But try to suggest, are there alternatives, and are there things that they could do, and having a health advocate with you is one strategy that has been used. Of it's not just you, but there's someone else making the case for you, because what the research finds is many persons, especially older persons of an older generation, just feel whatever the doctor says, I have to accept. I just say, go along with whatever he says, and being empowered to ask questions, and it helps to be more knowledgeable so you can at least ask the right questions. There was a book, I don't know if it's still around, but there was a book called, it was written by the People's Medical Society. It was entitled, Take This Book to the Doctor With You. And it was a really empowering book that it described going to a healthcare provider as going on a journey. But it was really insightful in suggesting the kinds of questions you need to ask so that you can get the right information, that you're fully informed, and that you could obtain the optimal care. I don't know if it's still published, but it was called Take This Book to the Doctor With You, published by the People's Medical Society.
Oh, that sounds really helpful. I know the hour grows late. Maybe just one more. Can you stay by for one more question?
Oh, yes, no problem. I'm fine.
Okay, I don't know. We may have to lose our Zoom connection pretty soon, but let me try one more question. Okay, how can healthcare better communicate with diverse populations about public health, prevention, disparities around access to vaccinations, etc.? And maybe a companion question, with all these statistics, what are some things I can do right now to help change the stats that you showed today for the better? In other words, I don't know this questioner, but perhaps improve the prospects for others.
So let's talk about what the healthcare system can do.
Yeah.
So one of the challenges with our healthcare system in general is that we really don't have a healthcare system. We have an illness care system. This may sound like a very radical statement, but it's the truth. The healthcare system, healthcare, medical care, as practiced in the United States, is not a driver of health. Does not have a lot to do with the health of the population. And let me break that down for you. The United States spends more money on medical care per person than any other country in the world. According to the World Bank, half of the money spent in the world on medical care annually is spent in the United States. We are less than 5% of the world's population, consume 1/2 of its medical resources, and rank near the bottom of the industrialized world on health. We have worse health. Even the college-educated in the United States who don't smoke and who exercise have worse health than their counterparts in Western Europe. And there are countries, even the white population in the United States ranks around 33rd or 34th from one year to the next on life expectancy in the world. In the 1980, we ranked 10th in the world. The US ranked 10th. If now we are 30 something in the world. The Black population, if it were a country, would be 90 something in the world on health. So there are countries like Cuba and Costa Rica that have better health as measured by life expectancy and infant mortality than the United States does. And we don't think of those as our peers. What is the problem? The Centers for Disease Control that estimates that we do not spend more than 3 cents of every dollar that's spent on medical care in this country is spent on prevention.
Yeah, right.
So our healthcare system does a great job of taking care of us once we get sick.
Right.
It's not a driver of whether we get sick or not in the first place.
Okay.
And so if you look at the major causes of death in the United States, like heart disease and cancer and stroke and high blood pressure and diabetes and obesity, all of these are driven by the way we live. Of course, there is genetics, and we didn't choose who our great-grandparents were, but much of those diseases, estimates from science indicates, can be prevented by the 8 laws of health, if you want to put it that way, by nutrition, sleep, exercise, how we live and how we work can have a huge impact on our health. And our healthcare system does not emphasize prevention. So one of the things that we need is a greater emphasis on prevention in our health systems, within our churches. We can educate, we can use that prevention to reach out to our communities and help them in practical ways and teach them how to live healthfully and how to reduce the risk of disease. So that's one thing we can do. But at the individual level, the first thing I encourage Seventh-day Adventists to do who ask me at the individual level at churches when I speak is, what do we need to do? I say, go read a book, Ministry of Healing. It literally spells out, there's a chapter on dealing with drug addicts. I showed you some examples of the quotations. There are practical guidelines that are spelled out more than 100 years ago that says this is the work of every church. So truly, what do we need to do? Understand our community, learn what the challenges are, get involved. If your church isn't doing anything, there are organizations out there that are meeting human needs. There are helplines, there are soup kitchens, there are homeless shelters, there are places where you can go and become involved and meet human need. So that's where we can begin at the individual level, and hopefully we can encourage others within our church community and our institutions to become involved in making a difference in the lives of people. But begin by being educated. This is not rocket science, and it's not new. We have the information, and that's why I encourage people, Ministry of Healing, read that book. It spells out a lot in detail of the kinds of priorities we should have.
Okay, that sounds fair. And maybe that's a good place to leave this just for this one session. Thank you again so much for being with us. All of us who've been working to plan this event have been excited for months about you being here. We are humbled by the information you've given us and by the presence of your spirit. Thank you so much for being here. And
Thank
if,
you.
if you don't mind, I'd like to offer a prayer as we leave the end this session.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you, Father, for the time that you have given us together with this person, this child of yours, who has chosen to live his life fully and openly and freely, and to share with the world what he has learned in order to make this world a better place. You have made this world, and you mean for all of us to live here in harmony with one another, in harmony with your magnificent laws of nature, and in harmony with the plan you have for our lives here and in the world to come. I pray, Father, that as we leave here, you will go with us and that you will speak to us as we remember and discuss further in the next coming days the ideas that have been shared with us by Dr. Williams. We pray in your name. Amen. Thank you, sir, and bless you.
All right. Thank you. It's
All
been
right.
great meeting with you, and all the best as you try to make a difference in the lives of others.
We're going to do it. We're going to do it together. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Good night.
Okay. Good night. Bye-bye.
And good night to all of you who are
Yes.
watching. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.